Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. The baby was crying, the door was locked, and her mother kept calling. Iana always picked up, until she didn't. It was Thursday, May 26, 2016, just after 9:40 a.m. in West Hollywood, California. The building sat on Holloway Drive, a quiet stretch surrounded by low-slung condominiums, eucalyptus trees, and residents who rarely got involved in each other's lives. But that morning, something was off. A woman, 63-year-old Olga Kasian, stood outside a third-floor unit, her voice shaking as she explained to deputies she hadn't heard from her daughter in over 24 hours. That daughter was Iana Kasian, 30 years old, a new mother, and she never went this long without returning a call. She'd been trying for hours. 911 was called. The responding deputies knocked, firmly, repeatedly, no answer. The baby could be heard faintly through the door, crying. Constant. The building's hallway surveillance system was inactive, disabled for maintenance, they were told. No neighbors had seen Iana leave. The lights inside the unit were off. The baby's cries weren't frantic, just persistent, rhythmic, raw. Iana Kasian had emigrated from Ukraine just a few years prior. She was fluent in 3 languages, held a law degree, and had transitioned to modeling and working in immigration law in Los Angeles. Friends described her as soft-spoken, elegant, and focused. She'd recently given birth to a baby girl, her first child, with her fiancé, Blake Label. They lived together in the apartment Olga now stood outside of. And Iana hadn't shown up to a single postpartum appointment that week. Deputies ran a welfare check and asked the property manager for access. Legally, they couldn't enter without probable cause or a signed warrant. At that point, there was no sign of forced entry, no screaming, no immediate proof of danger beyond the mother's concern. So they left, but something lingered in the air, a gut instinct they couldn't yet act on. Later that day, Olga went to a nearby LAPD station and filed a formal missing persons report. She told officers her daughter had texted the night of May 23rd and mentioned being emotionally drained and that Blake wasn't sleeping. When asked if there had been domestic issues, Olga hesitated, then said quietly, "I think he's not well. He's not stable." Officers reviewed Blake's history, no prior arrests, no formal complaints, but there was a civil case, a recent lawsuit over unpaid debts filed just weeks earlier, and a notice of eviction dated May 18th. In his social media profiles, Blake styled himself as a writer and graphic novelist. His work, dark, psychological, often grotesque. He had a trust fund. He had connections in Hollywood. But it was Iana who was supporting the home in recent months, something that came up more than once during interviews with her friends. By May 27th, the LAPD obtained a warrant. When officers returned to the apartment around 1:15 a.m. that morning, what they found required little explanation. Entry was forced. The baby girl was discovered in a side room, alive, dehydrated, wrapped in a blood-stained towel. There was no food nearby, no formula, no bottles, just silence. And in the master bedroom, the body of Iana Kasian. She was lying on the mattress, partially covered, pale, lifeless, motionless. But the officers didn't initially recognize it as a homicide scene. There was no pooling blood, no trauma visible from a distance. But the smell, stale iron, decomposing tissue, said otherwise. A homicide detective would later write, "It was the cleanest violent crime scene I'd ever walked into." That was the problem. Officers detained Blake Label inside the apartment. He had barricaded himself in with the body. He offered no explanation, no resistance, no emotion. He was clean-shaven, calm, and appeared to be under the influence of sedatives. He didn't ask why they were there. He didn't ask about the baby. Within the hour, the unit was sealed off. A forensic team was called in. Digital evidence extraction began at 3:45 a.m. Preliminary examination of the apartment showed signs of deep sanitization, bleach residue on tile, scrubbed-down counters, and trace blood evidence detectable only under specialized UV and chemical agents. A preliminary forensic sweep revealed fragments of human tissue in the bathroom sink trap. Under the bed, a blood-stained towel, hair fibers, and what appeared to be a severed piece of soft tissue. Outside, in the alley dumpster, investigators found something else. A plastic bag containing strands of long brown hair, a section of human scalp, and biological residue matching Iana's mitochondrial DNA. Detectives noted there was no evidence of forced entry or struggle, no sign Iana tried to escape, no neighbors reported hearing anything, no screaming, no fighting, not even raised voices, just silence. Forensic specialists believed she had been killed sometime between the night of May 23rd and the morning of May 25th, placing her body in the room with the child for upwards of 36 hours. The lead detective wrote in his report, "This was not spontaneous, this was not rage, it was procedural, controlled, like someone following instructions. No murder weapon was found. There was no obvious method of injury until the autopsy, but that's for another chapter." By 6:10 a.m. on May 27, 2016, the scene had been photographed, cataloged, and sealed. The coroner's van arrived on site at 6:52. Iana Kasian's body was removed under full containment protocol and transported directly to the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner Coroner's Facility on Mission Road. She was placed under case ID number 21052644. No next of kin were present. The preliminary visual inspection did not offer obvious answers. There were no gunshot wounds, no ligature marks, no puncture trauma or massive blunt force injuries visible at skin level. But there was one immediate anomaly noted by Deputy Coroner Renee Donnell. The absence of blood was biologically inconsistent with the external state of the body. Internal examination began at 9:05 a.m. Standard Y incision, no contents in the stomach, minimal intestinal material suggesting Iana had not eaten in at least 24 hours. The major organs showed early decomposition markers accelerated by heat exposure and a closed, unventilated environment. Time of death was estimated between May 24th and 25. What stood out wasn't what the body revealed, but what it lacked. The external scalp had been removed. A full section of skin and hair was missing from the top of the head, cleanly detached. There were micro-abrasions around the orbital bones and upper cheeks consistent with applied pressure from hands or a blunt surface. Petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes confirmed prolonged oxygen deprivation. She had not died instantly. There were shallow contusions, linear, repeating, and organized, on the ribs and thighs. The injuries had been administered in sequences, not bursts. The cause of death was listed as exsanguination due to sharp force trauma combined with cranial tissue damage and prolonged antemortem assault. In layman's terms, she bled to death over time under sustained physical abuse. Toxicology returned negative for recreational or prescription drugs. Blood alcohol, 0.0. There were no defense wounds, no fractures to fingers or knuckles. She hadn't fought back, or hadn't been able to. DNA swabs from under the fingernails returned only trace levels of Iana's own epithelial cells. No foreign skin cells. No indicators of violent resistance. But what couldn't be found on her body was being mapped from the scene she was found in. In the apartment bathroom sink trap, lab analysts recovered epithelial traces embedded in soap scum layers, suggesting efforts to clean bloodied hands. In the shower drain, a filter screen held partial tissue strands, non-scalp related, likely nasal or interfacial origin. The bathroom walls tested positive for latent blood proteins using phenolphthalein and luminol reagents, though no visible staining remained. On the hallway baseboard behind the nursery door, they found diluted blood plasma consistent with post-mortem seepage patterns, indicating the body had been moved prior to final placement. The body had not decomposed evenly. There was skin slippage along the back and neck, but the interior remained relatively intact. This was consistent with passive exposure. No attempt to conceal, but also no immediate disposal. That suggested confidence, or a total break from reality. No fingerprints other than Iana's and the resident male occupant were present in the apartment. No forced entry, no sign of robbery. All valuables were untouched. The bedroom closet was fully organized. The kitchen had no signs of disruption. The high chair for the infant was clean and unused. The autopsy concluded with a notation rarely entered into official documents. Non-accidental trauma consistent with intentional soft tissue removal. Scene behavior may indicate psychological delusion or symbolic act. Detective Kevin Borer, present at the coroner's office during the final review, later wrote in his case memo, "We don't typically note motive in physical remains, but this wasn't just assault. This was demonstration, the kind you don't learn, you imagine." The medical report, signed and certified on May 30th, was submitted to the district attorney's office. By that point, detectives had already launched a secondary forensic protocol. cross-referencing creative works belonging to the resident male with the forensic profile discovered on Iana's body. But no conclusions were drawn, not yet, because with every tissue sample and negative toxicology screen, the same question repeated. How did no one hear a sound? No thuds, no screams, no glass breaking, just a baby crying, and silence. The apartment had been processed, the body examined, and the initial forensic report filed. But the case wasn't closing, it was unfolding. And as investigators traced through digital devices, court records, and creative property tied to the residence, they uncovered a series of documents that shifted the tone of the investigation entirely. Among the seized items from the Holloway Drive unit was a hardcover graphic novel titled Syndrome. At first glance, it was just another high-gloss indie horror book. But something about it raised immediate concerns, particularly to Detective Borer, who was reviewing items logged during evidence intake. The story detailed a fictional neuroscientist seeking to isolate the root of evil by monitoring a serial killer's behavior inside a controlled environment. In its final chapters, the killer engages in methodical scalp removal while speaking in clinical detachment. That detail hadn't been released publicly. Yet it matched the autopsy findings almost exactly. A secondary search warrant was issued to collect additional creative materials from the suspect's former work studio, located in a shared commercial space in Beverly Grove. Inside a locked drawer, detectives found 2 unpublished manuscripts, 3 notebooks of character sketches, and over 40 pages of hand-illustrated scenes involving female victims in restrained positions, frequently with missing facial features or exposed cranial structures. The illustrations were not just stylized, they were anatomical. The team contacted the publishing house behind Syndrome and confirmed the suspect had co-authored the book. In email threads recovered through subpoenaed accounts, he described the story as a reflection of controlled fear and less fiction, more thesis. These emails dated back to early 2015, long before the incident. One line read, "Real violence isn't chaos. It's geometry." Digital forensics from seized devices further deepened the investigative trajectory. A MacBook Pro recovered from the residence contained several folders marked "Do Not Open," inside of which were images saved under generic file names, IMG 0101, IMG 0102, and so on. Analysts recovered time-stamped files containing images of the crime scene, taken before law enforcement arrived. Metadata confirmed the photos were taken using a mobile device linked to the suspect's personal Apple ID. The existence of these photos, captured and stored, meant the crime had not only been executed but observed and documented. There was also a note saved to the device's native text app created on May 25th at 3:48 a.m. It read simply, "Proof before perception. Without a witness, the act has no meaning." Investigators flagged it as potential psycholinguistic evidence of intention, later referenced in court filings. Beyond that, the subject's browser history revealed late-night queries including, how long does it take to die from blood loss? How to dissolve tissue and drain? Cleaning blood off tile without bleach? How much blood is in the average adult female? All search entries occurred between May 24th and May 26th, just before police made their final entry into the residence. This timeline aligned with coroner estimates, forming a tight digital map that left little room for ambiguity. Detectives also noted the absence of panic or evasion in the subject's online behavior. There were no signs of attempting to wipe data, disable accounts, or conceal IP addresses. This absence of obfuscation was flagged as notable, not because it cleared suspicion, but because it suggested either a detachment from consequence or a level of premeditation where exposure was irrelevant. When investigators compared the forensic findings from the autopsy to the visual and narrative content in the suspect's creative works, a chilling pattern emerged. The injury mapping, posture of the body, and even the silence surrounding the scene mirrored scenarios laid out in fiction. In consultation with a forensic psychiatrist, the department examined whether these correlations could be classified as projective violence, acts rooted in obsessive ideation that later manifest in controlled, ritualistic behavior. The psychiatrist's assessment stated, "There's no indication the subject distinguished between the authored universe and the actual event." This raised a question investigators could not yet fully answer. Was the crime a product of psychological breakdown or the execution of a creative hypothesis brought to life? The line between fiction and evidence had blurred. But there was still one thing fiction couldn't do: generate blood patterns, leave behind DNA, and construct timelines verified by server logs. The case was no longer theoretical, it was procedural, and every click, every drawing, every typed line now sat under forensic review. By the time forensic analysts returned to Holloway Drive on May 28, 2016, the initial shock of the crime scene had been replaced by a different challenge: reconstruction. Not of how the victim died, autopsy had already filled in those blanks, but when and under what conditions. For investigators, the absence of noise wasn't just metaphorical, it was physical. There were no alarms, no interruptions, and most notably, no activity from the child for nearly 2 days aside from one consistent sound. The baby's cry, environmental forensics, rarely dramatic but always essential, took center stage. Crime scene analysts focused on perishable data, temperature gradients, decomposition progression, air quality inside the unit, and the state of surrounding materials. The unit's central AC was off and windows were sealed. That created what investigators later referred to as a sealed decay chamber. Ambient temperatures inside the bedroom hovered between 82 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit, with minimal air circulation. These conditions accelerated tissue breakdown, allowing forensic entomologists to estimate time of death with greater accuracy. The coroner had already placed Iana Kasian's death between May 24th and 25. That conclusion was reinforced through post-mortem lividity, the drying of mucous membranes, and the pattern of skin slippage concentrated along the back. Investigators found a clear imprint of livor mortis against the wood floor, indicating that her body had been placed there, face up, for a significant time before being moved onto the bed where police found her. That movement wasn't random, it created a new timeline. The presence of lividity along the lower back, with blanched pressure zones at the scapula and heels, supported a theory. The victim was originally positioned supine on a hard surface for at least 6 hours before being repositioned. Forensics also confirmed that the blood pools that would typically signal active trauma had been manually cleaned or absorbed, not through passive drying alone. Tests on the mattress showed multiple absorbent materials: towels, one adult-sized blanket, and 2 layers of cotton fabric, each containing hemoglobin degradation markers consistent with 18 to 36 hours post-mortem exposure. What happened inside that unit occurred in phases, not in frenzy. But the stillness didn't stop with the victim. Child Protective Services launched a parallel inquiry the same day to determine how long the newborn had been left unattended. Formula residue in the infant bottle was hardened. Trace elements matched to Similac powder, mixed approximately 36-48 hours before discovery. No additional feeding sources were found. The child had mild dehydration, low glucose levels, and signs of exposure to elevated carbon dioxide, a byproduct of enclosed, unventilated environments. She had been alone for over a day, possibly 2. On the nursery floor, forensic techs identified a diaper disposal bin with elevated ammonia readings and a second diaper heavily soiled but dry, suggesting no change had occurred since before the estimated time of death. The conclusion: the child had survived amid decomposition, in a sealed unit, within 10 feet of a body for more than 36 hours. Behavioral analysts were brought in to assist. One observation became central to the prosecution's timeline theory. If the child wasn't harmed, wasn't crying constantly, and wasn't removed from the apartment, that suggested whoever was responsible had remained inside. Monitoring, present, possibly documenting, more than just who had access. Investigators now had to determine how long the apartment had remained undisturbed and why. The building's swipe card data showed no activity from the suspect's key fob between the evening of May 23rd and the time of forced police entry. No food deliveries, no phone calls made. Just one outgoing message from the suspect's device on May 24th at 2:12 a.m., pinged from the Wi-Fi inside the unit. A photo sent to a personal email address, file name, final.chasset.jpg. Authorities never publicly disclosed the image. As technicians mapped out the probable movements inside the unit, a pattern emerged. The kitchen was unused. No meals prepared after May 23rd. The bathroom had been cleaned, but only superficially. Bleach traces were concentrated at drain openings, but absent from surrounding grout. That suggested deliberate targeting, not general cleanup. No efforts had been made to alter the thermostat or preserve the body. No concealment materials were found. In short, there was no attempt to flee. But there was clear evidence of observation, calculation, and control of the scene. A freeze in behavior, something that for seasoned detectives meant only one thing: confidence or psychosis. This wasn't a panic act. This was staged inertia. And that made investigators reassess not only how the victim died, but how long she had been watched afterward. As one detective noted in his case log, murder is action, but silence, stillness, those are choices too. In true crime, timing isn't just about when the murder occurred. It's about what preceded it and whether anyone saw it coming. Iana Kasian's final days weren't marked by violence, at least not on the surface. There were no documented police calls, no visible bruises noted by her physician, no restraining orders filed. But investigators working the case in late May 2016 weren't just interested in violence. They were interested in control, and control leaves a trail. Financial records pulled via subpoena showed that in the 2 months leading up to Iana's death, she had withdrawn herself from multiple shared accounts. The apartment's rent, previously paid by the suspect, had bounced in April. In early May, Iana used her own savings, approximately $3,000, to make a one-time rent payment directly to the building's management. The transaction occurred on May 4th. She had not done that before. She also stopped using joint credit cards. Her final charges, purchases for infant supplies, a small grocery run, and a pharmacy visit, were all processed on her personal debit card. All were dated between May 18th and May 22nd. Investigators viewed this not simply as financial independence, it was isolation. Text logs obtained from Iana's iPhone showed no outgoing messages to the suspect in the 48 hours before her death. Instead, her last 3 conversations were with her mother, her cousin in Ukraine, and a friend who had recently offered to help with babysitting. Those texts painted a subtle but telling picture. Iana had grown exhausted. One message from May 22nd read, "He doesn't help anymore. He's in his room all night." Another, "I don't know if I'm safe here, but where do I go with the baby?" There were no threats in the text, no accusations, just patterns. The kind that don't raise alarms, but in hindsight, become red flags. Behavioral analysis focused on what came next. In the days before Iana stopped responding, the suspect had begun pulling away from external obligations. He missed a scheduled civil hearing on May 16th. He ceased contact with business collaborators after May 20th. His last email was sent on May 21st with a single sentence. "I need to reset." He made no future appointments. He didn't reschedule anything. His phone records reflected only internal data usage. No calls, no messages, no search queries until the now notorious May 24th browser activity began. Detectives referred to this window, May 21st to May 23rd, as the behavioral collapse. A point when daily habits ceased and internal fixations seemed to take over. While there was no direct confession, the absence of normal life functions became its own kind of statement. This is where context mattered. A crime is rarely spontaneous, but in the absence of a documented fight or trigger, investigators had to reconstruct a different framework, psychological tension, one that doesn't explode. It decays. In interviews, Iana's mother recalled that her daughter hadn't left the apartment since giving birth. She was healing, resting, tired, but she had plans to take her daughter for passport photos, plans to return to light work by summer. She had just renewed her driver's license. She was not preparing to disappear. If there had been a fight, no one heard it. If there had been a warning, it didn't come through conventional means. The only evidence was behavioral drift, quiet, chilling, and irreversible. And in the world of forensic psychology, that is often where the truest motive lies. Not in a weapon, not in a confession, but in silence before the act. Los Angeles County Superior Court, June 2018. It had been 2 years since Iana Kasian was found dead in a West Hollywood apartment. 2 years since her newborn was rescued from the same room. 2 years since her mother stood in a hallway calling a daughter who no longer had the ability to answer. But for the court, none of that would matter unless the prosecution could answer a single question, one that defines every murder case at its core. Was it intentional? From the beginning, the defense did not deny the victim's death. They didn't challenge the forensic timeline. They didn't contest the existence of injuries. What they aimed to dismantle was intent. They offered no confession, but instead constructed an argument around mental instability, emotional breakdown, and postnatal stress affecting the defendant's judgment. The prosecution went in the opposite direction: control, planning, escalation. Their key exhibit wasn't a weapon, it was a book. Syndrome, a 96-page graphic novel co-written by the defendant years earlier, became a central piece of evidence, not because it depicted violence, that's protected speech, but because of how closely it mirrored the forensic reality of Iana's death. Investigators laid the two side by side, the narrative panels and the crime scene photos. In both, the victim was immobilized. In both, the scalp was removed. In both, the act was performed in silence, with no apparent motive except to observe. These were not accidental parallels. On the stand, LAPD forensic analyst Maya Alston testified that the wound mapping from the autopsy matched the illustrated trauma in the book, not just in style, but in structure, the sequence, the anatomical precision, the absence of other injuries. This wasn't rage, it was replication. The prosecution then introduced digital forensics. Metadata from the suspect's laptop showed image files created during the same window of time that the coroner believed Iana was still alive. The most incriminating, a photo labeled finalset.jpg taken in the apartment and sent via email to the suspect's own account. Time-stamped 2:12 a.m., May 24, 2016. No further photos or messages were sent. Nothing was deleted. Everything was preserved. This wasn't panic. This was documentation. There were also browser search logs, previously covered in the investigation but now introduced as evidence of premeditation. Search terms included: how long does it take to bleed out from scalp wound? Pressure points to cause unconsciousness. Is death by blood loss painful? All dated before police entry. All retrieved from the defendant's personal laptop. All recovered without the need for password cracking. The defense argued these were research notes, the product of a writer exploring dark material for creative work. But prosecutors countered with the fact that the actual crime matched the notes, not in theme, but in execution. And that's where creative freedom ends and forensic reality begins. During closing arguments, prosecutors emphasized that intent does not require verbal confirmation. It doesn't need a confession. It can be proven through actions, patterns of behavior, environmental control, and choices made after the event. In this case, the cleanup, the photos, the preserved infant. Every detail supported not just knowledge, but planning. As a procedural point, jurors were instructed not to be influenced by emotion. But as one retired forensic psychologist later told a CBS documentary team, you can't look at that scene and not feel the cold, not from temperature, but from calculation. On June 20th, 2018, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder with special circumstances of torture and aggravated mayhem. The court ruled unanimously that the crime was intentional, premeditated, and cruel beyond legal minimums. At sentencing, there were no statements from the defendant, no apology, no explanation, just the final words from the bench: life without parole. And for Iana's family, it meant the story wouldn't end in ambiguity, it wouldn't bring her back, but it brought definition. Criminal convictions end trials, but they don't end consequences. In February 2019, nearly 3 years after Iana Kasian's death, a separate legal proceeding began. It wasn't about guilt. That had already been proven. This time, it was about responsibility. In civil court, that means damages. And for the Kasian family, it meant fighting not just for justice, but for the future of a little girl left behind in the aftermath of one of Los Angeles's most disturbing homicides. The case was filed under Kasian et al. v. Blake libel, a wrongful death civil lawsuit brought by Iana's mother, Olga, on behalf of both herself and her granddaughter, who at that time was just 3 years old. Unlike criminal court, the burden of proof in civil cases is lower. It doesn't require proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Instead, it requires a preponderance of evidence, more likely than not, but in this case, the evidence was overwhelming. The autopsy, the forensic timeline, the digital files, and the conviction itself had already done the heavy lifting. What the civil court needed to assess was impact. During proceedings, expert testimony focused on the psychological and developmental risk posed to a child who had survived the early hours of life inside a room where her mother's body lay undisturbed for days. Pediatric forensic psychologists testified that exposure to decomposition gases, prolonged crying without response, and isolation during critical bonding windows could result in long-term emotional dysregulation, even in infants who cannot consciously remember the event. Olga Kasian also testified, not to prove harm, but to describe the scope of it. She spoke in translated Ukrainian about what it meant to raise her granddaughter without ever saying the word father. She explained how she had to create a version of the truth her granddaughter could understand, one that didn't require describing what her mother's body looked like or why no one had come for them sooner. Court transcripts recorded her statement with minimal interruption. It wasn't sensational, it was procedural, precise, but the numbers that followed were not abstract. In July 2019, the Los Angeles County Civil Court awarded $41.6 million in damages. That included $17 million for past and future emotional suffering, $9 million for loss of financial support, $10 million in punitive damages, and the remainder for medical expenses and legal fees. It was one of the largest wrongful death awards related to a domestic homicide in California that year. Of course, Blake Leibel had no income. His assets, whatever remained, were tied up in family trust structures in Canada. The damages were symbolic in practice, but in law they established public record that beyond the criminal verdict there was civil responsibility that would follow him indefinitely. And there was another reason the case mattered. Public reaction to the civil suit reignited interest in the broader implications of domestic violence that doesn't look like violence. Iana Kasian had no known history of physical abuse. No one had ever called 911. No restraining order was filed, yet her death was brutal, methodical, and entirely preventable. That distinction became a key focus in outreach campaigns by domestic violence prevention groups across California, particularly in immigrant and first-generation communities where reporting abuse can carry fears of stigma, isolation, or deportation. The aftermath of Iana's murder became a case study in how psychological isolation, economic control, and emotional withdrawal can precede physical violence, even if it's never spoken aloud. And that message, more than the verdict or the dollar amount, is what gave this case its lasting impact. Today, Iana's daughter lives in Europe with her grandmother. Her name was legally changed. She is not shown in media. She attends school, she is healthy, and she is, in every way that matters, alive because of one decision: a grandmother who didn't stop calling, even when no one answered. The courtroom was filled but not tense. By the time the trial reached its final week, no one was expecting any last-minute surprises. The evidence had been relentless, clinical, chronological, and impossible to ignore. Prosecutors relied less on emotion than on hard sequencing. Blood pattern analysis, cell phone location history, metadata from photographs, and the meticulous findings from the autopsy. The presentation was so tightly interwoven that even minor discrepancies in the suspect's story had nowhere to hide. Jurors heard how digital forensic examiners extracted deleted messages, recovered corrupted files, and reconstructed exact device activity within the window of death. The apartment's smart lock system recorded every entry and exit. The timelines didn't leave room for doubt. Prosecutors didn't need a confession. They had facts, irreversible, time-stamped, layered facts that did what emotions couldn't. Forensic pathologists testified to the nature and timing of the wounds. They spoke in blunt, unambiguous terms. The absence of hesitation marks, the angle of force, the delayed onset of unconsciousness, the signs of prolonged suffering. Their testimonies painted a picture that didn't require adjectives. The data was horrifying enough. When the jury returned with a guilty verdict on May 3, 2025, it was unanimous. No reactions in the gallery, just silence. Even the convicted remained motionless, as if awaiting a cue that never came. The judge handed down a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. The finality in the courtroom didn't echo. It landed like a sealed envelope, delivered, accepted, archived. But courtrooms don't absorb trauma. They only process it. Outside of that legal conclusion, the ripples remained. For the victim's mother, justice was not about retribution. It was about naming what happened and making sure no one ever tried to soften it. In a short impact statement, she wrote, "This was not a crime of passion. It was a decision made and carried out. I hope you remember her name. I hope you remember that you made a choice." For the officers who first responded to the scene, the case would haunt protocol training for years. One detective later admitted in an internal review that something in the air had felt wrong when they first stepped inside that apartment. Not just the smell or the eerie quiet, but the calculated way everything had been wiped down, like someone knew exactly what evidence was traceable and what wasn't. That internal review led to revised response procedures. Officers in the county are now required to document not only what they observe, but what they suspect, even when evidence is inconclusive. The goal is not to assume guilt prematurely, but to leave room for patterns to emerge later. And that small change, writing a gut feeling into a report, has already altered the trajectory of two unrelated domestic violence investigations since. In the months following the verdict, advocacy groups referenced the case in private briefings. They didn't sensationalize it. They used it to show why early signs matter: abrupt relationship shifts, isolation from friends, financial control masked as protection, behavioral changes chalked up to stress. None of those things are crimes on their own, but they often precede something irreversible. A local mental health nonprofit launched a new community outreach project in the victim's name, aimed at training young adults to spot signs of coercive control. The program doesn't offer therapy. It offers literacy, the kind that teaches people how to name manipulation before it metastasizes into violence. The story also reached unexpected places. A university criminal justice department quietly rewrote part of their forensic psychology curriculum after studying the case. A former classmate of the defendant posted a short essay online about how charisma can sometimes obscure pathology. The essay was reshared thousands of times, not because it was dramatic, but because it reminded people that good upbringing doesn't guarantee safety, and intelligence doesn't mean someone can't do something monstrous. That's the complexity of cases like this. The justice system doesn't erase the crime, it marks its boundaries. But what happens beyond those boundaries is what determines whether a community learns or simply moves on. As for the building where it happened, the unit was sealed for several months. Property management made quiet renovations. New tenants eventually moved in. Whether they knew the history is unclear. Some neighbors still crossed the street when passing that block, out of habit more than fear. But the incident didn't vanish. It simply receded into the background noise of a city that has seen too many silent tragedies. People sometimes think that the end of a trial is the end of a story, but true crime isn't about endings, it's about timelines. And every timeline carries a forked path: what happened and what could have happened. The former is fixed, the latter is where prevention lives. Sometimes justice doesn't come with peace. It comes with silence, with lessons carved from tragedy. If there's one thing I've taken from this case, it's that evil rarely looks like a monster. It often wears the face of someone charming, educated, respected. And that's exactly why we must pay attention to the quiet warning signs we're taught to ignore. Let me ask you, have you ever second-guessed your gut because someone else convinced you they meant well? Or dismissed a controlling behavior as love? It's not always easy to see the line until it's been crossed. If this story made you think, even just for a moment, please share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from or what part of the case stayed with you. And if it didn't sit right, I'd like to hear that too. This space is for all of us. If you found this video meaningful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Someone out there might need to hear what you heard today.